As a committed feminist, that was the research that we engaged in. It was not about concerns that trans women would prey on other women in washrooms, but whether this was going to provide some space or license, or whether there would be an evidence of increased violence in washrooms and in change rooms because of policies like this one. And that was the evidence that we didn't find, and that was the evidence that other police forces and municipalities had been asked to produce when they were discussing protocols like this one, whether cis men would take advantage of it, waltz into a woman's washroom and say, hey, I can be here, and then turn around and assault a young woman there. And I think it probably makes sense that that wouldn't really happen, because if somebody was there to ask the question, they would probably be there to ensure that there is safety for people. I think the kinds of assaults that we're concerned about happen in spaces where there aren't people around to ask the questions.
So I appreciate the clarification on that. Thank you.
Councillor Green.
Thank you. And just for clarity, to clarify the clarity, through you, Madam Chair, in situations of predatory straight male violence, there are currently laws and law enforcement in place to deal with that, correct?
That is correct.
In theory.
It is correct that there continues to be violence against women and girls, cis and trans, in our community, and against boys and men, as we've heard. It is correct that we have police forces and security guards whose job it is to protect people, and I'm sure city staff do that work also on behalf of the young people that they care for. It's also correct that those kinds of activities are prohibited by law. And I think that all of that is carefully considered by this protocol.
And it's also correct that, unfortunately, given our current legal system, there are still many cases of gender violence that goes not just unreported, but dismissed when it does hit law enforcement. So that's, I'm sure, a conversation for another day, you know, given recent reports from the CBC and others. But my question to you, I'll ask you the same question that I asked the person who came before us as a constitutional expert. What positions would your association take should this fail here today? Is there remedy or recourse at higher levels of court of law to enforce what we have essentially put before us?
Well, the city, as I understand it, has already faced a human rights complaint and is obligated to create a protocol of some kind to address the fact that there was a failing in this case. I would imagine that if the city then failed to implement what it agreed to do, what it undertook to do as part of that settlement following a human rights complaint, that there would be further penalties pending. That wouldn't come from us. If there were a case that went forward, I imagine that CCLA would be interested in intervening and providing our advice as well to the court.
And could you just, for the public record today, state exactly who your organization is and what it does?
Sure. I am the director of the Equality Program for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. We're a national, non-profit, non-governmental organization that works to protect the rights and freedoms of all people in Canada. We engage in various forms of advocacy and public engagement, and we also engage in litigation, usually, not always, sometimes we initiate litigation, but usually in the form of an intervener who comes to the court as a friend of the court to provide our expertise and advice to the judges who are hearing difficult constitutional and human rights issues.
Well, I certainly appreciate that clarity, and thank you very much for being here before us today.
Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. Just quickly, Madam Chair, I'd like to thank Councillor Green and Ms. Mendelsohn-Aviv and Councillor Whitehead for clarifying a lot of the legal questions that pertain to the trans protocol. An argument that I make to do with the protocol that I think matters in this specific conversation is that the City of Hamilton, of course, has a legal obligation to respect transgender equality, and additionally, we need to think about our ethical obligation to respect transgender equality and the things that we need to do that may be above and beyond the baseline of our minimal legal obligation. So that's a very interesting conversation, and I'd like to thank Ms. Mendelsohn-Aviv for helping us think about both the law and the ethics of this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Noah, for your presentation. We're moving on to our